Inside Kingston Penitentiary, the prison that shaped Canada's justice system, the first thing most men noticed was the wall. Not its height, though that mattered, or the way it pressed the sky into a narrow strip. It was the weight of it. Limestone quarried and stacked with 19th-century certainty, built to last longer than the people inside it. Kingston Penitentiary stood here for nearly 2 centuries, older than Confederation, older than the modern idea of Canada itself. Before anyone crossed its threshold, the building had already made its argument. Arrival was not dramatic. It was procedural. A vehicle slowed, a gate opened, a gate closed. Paperwork moved from one hand to another. Names were checked against numbers. The process stripped away context with practiced efficiency. Whatever story a man carried with him, how he arrived here, what he had lost, what he still believed, did not travel past the intake desk. Inside, the air changed. It was colder in winter, heavy in summer. Sound carried strangely through stone corridors, footsteps echoing longer than expected, voices flattening against the walls. The architecture did not invite conversation. It narrowed it. Every hallway funneled movement forward, toward instructions already decided. For men entering Kingston for the first time, the loss of personal freedom did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in small, administrative moments. Shoes placed on a marked line. Pockets turned inside out. Clothing replaced with institutional fabric that neither fit nor failed to fit. Personal items logged, boxed, labeled, and sealed away. Identity reduced to what could be written on a card. The prison was designed for order, not comfort. Cells were narrow, stone-lined, and unyielding. Early designs emphasized isolation as a tool of reform. Silence was not incidental. It was intentional. Even as the institution evolved, that original philosophy lingered in the layout, in the distance between doors, in the way light struggled to reach the lower tiers. The first walk to a cell often happened without ceremony. An officer led the way. Keys clinked. Hinges protested. A door opened inward. The cell waited. A cot, a thin mattress, a toilet, a sink. Some men noticed the smell first, others the quiet. The door closed with a sound that did not echo so much as settle. That sound marked a boundary. Before it, movement required permission. After it, stillness was enforced. There was no speech prepared for this moment. No explanation that could soften it. The institution relied on the space itself to do the work. The walls taught quickly. They taught that time here would move differently. That privacy was conditional. That observation was constant even when unseen. Many men remembered the first few hours not as fear, but as confusion. Instructions came quickly and without repetition. Where to stand. When to speak. When not to. The body learned before the mind caught up. Shoulders tightened. Breathing shortened. The awareness of being watched settled into the muscles. Kingston Penitentiary had been many things over the years. A symbol of state authority, a laboratory for reform, a warehouse for punishment. But to the person arriving it was simpler. It was a place that removed choice. Not just large choices but small ones. When to eat. When to sleep. When to step outside. When to speak to another human being. The first night did not bring clarity. It brought stillness. Lights dimmed but never fully disappeared. Sounds traveled from cell to cell. A cough, a distant voice, metal on metal. Men lay awake, staring at ceilings they could nearly touch, measuring time by sensations rather than clocks. Outside the walls, the city of Kingston went about its evening. Cars passed. Houses warmed. Inside, the institution held its breath as it had done for generations, absorbing another set of lives into its long memory. No announcement marked the transition. But something had already shifted. The prison had begun to shape the person inside it, just as it had shaped the country's understanding of punishment, order, and control. The first night in the shape of time. Night inside Kingston did not feel like night elsewhere. Darkness was incomplete. Silence was uneven. Time loosened its grip on familiar markers. For many men, the first night was the longest not because of fear, but because of the absence of distraction. There was nothing left to do but think, and thinking had nowhere to go. The body remained alert long after exhaustion should have taken over. Every sound carried significance. A door closing several cells away felt close enough to touch. A shouted instruction echoed longer than expected. The mind tried to map the space using sound alone, tracing corridors, counting doors, estimating distance. Sleep came in fragments. When it arrived, it was light and easily broken. Dreams folded into waking thoughts. Faces from outside appeared without warning. Regrets surfaced not as speeches but as images. A missed moment. A decision revisited too late. Memory here was not comforting. Was invasive. The psychological disorientation of that first night was not accidental. Kingston's design had been shaped by the belief that reflection would lead to reform. Solitude was once considered a moral tool. Though policies changed, the architecture remained. Stone does not forget its original purpose. Men learned quickly that time inside was experienced collectively, but endured individually. Even surrounded by others, the cell imposed a private reckoning. There was no audience for despair. No immediate relief from it either. Morning eventually arrived, announced by routine rather than light. Doors opened on schedule. Voices called out instructions. The day began not with choice, but with movement dictated by bells and orders. The first night receded, but it did not disappear. It became a reference point, a dividing line between before and after. In those early days, men watched more than they spoke. They studied how others moved through space, who made eye contact, who avoided it, who walked with confidence, who kept their shoulders tight. An informal education began immediately. Survival depended less on strength than on observation. Kingston had its own internal order, shaped by decades of shared confinement. Hierarchies were not always announced. They were inferred. Some men commanded space without raising their voices. Others learned quickly to keep to the edges. Respect was measured in small exchanges. A nod, a step aside, a refusal to intrude. Hunger arrived on schedule and stayed. Meals were functional, predictable, rarely satisfying. They punctuated the day, providing structure more than nourishment. Boredom filled the spaces between. Long stretches of waiting became the dominant experience. Waiting for count. Waiting for movement. Waiting for time itself to pass. The strain was cumulative. Not dramatic. Not explosive. It settled slowly like dust. Men coped in different ways. Some turned inward, building routines inside routines. Push-ups beside the cot. Books read and reread. Others sought connection where it was permitted, speaking through bars, exchanging fragments of personal history without detail. Faith found space here, not always religious but ritualistic. Repetition offered control where choice was limited. Education programs, when available, provided a different rhythm, a way to mark progress in a place resistant to it. Learning became a quiet form of resistance against stagnation. Yet isolation remained. Even in shared spaces, the awareness of separation persisted. The institution was always present, shaping interactions, setting limits. Brotherhood existed, but it was cautious, bounded by rules written and unwritten. As days accumulated, the first night faded into a memory, but its imprint remained. It taught men how this place worked, how it thought, how it expected them to adapt. Kingston did not rush this lesson. It allowed time to do the work. Routine, hierarchy, and the long middle. After the first weeks, the prison revealed its true character. Not in moments of crisis but in repetition. Kingston's power lay in routine. The days aligned themselves into patterns so consistent they became difficult to distinguish from one another. This was not chaos. It was control through predictability. Work assignments offered structure, though not everyone received one. Those who did learned the rhythms of labor inside stone walls. Tasks were practical, sometimes monotonous, occasionally demanding. The work mattered less than the routine it enforced. Hours filled. Bodies tired. Time moved, if only incrementally. Hierarchy was present, but it did not always resemble what outsiders imagined. It was not constant conflict. It was negotiation. Space, resources, and attention were limited. Men learned how to occupy their place without drawing notice. Power shifted subtly, influenced by age, experience, and reputation rather than force alone. Violence was not the defining feature of daily life. Its possibility was enough. Most days passed without incident, but awareness remained. Men learned to read rooms quickly, to sense when to speak and when to stay silent. These skills were not taught formally. They were absorbed. Hunger and boredom continued to shape behavior. Commissary items became currency, not officially but practically. A packet of coffee, a bar of soap, something sweet. These small comforts carried weight in an environment where scarcity was the norm. Mental strain did not announce itself loudly. It showed up in posture, in irritability, in withdrawal. Long sentences stretched time into something abstract. Short sentences compressed it into anxiety about release. Both carried their own burdens. Some men turned to education as a way to reclaim agency. Classes offered more than information. They offered an alternative identity, student, learner, someone in motion. Others found solace in writing letters, maintaining a fragile connection to life beyond the walls. Memory was a constant companion. It arrived uninvited during routine tasks. A song overheard. A smell from the kitchen. These moments connected the present to a past that felt both close and unreachable. Kingston's age was always visible. Pipes rattled. Stone chipped. The building carried the marks of generations. Men became aware that they were part of a long line, each passing through the same spaces, leaving little behind but time served. Adaptation was not surrender. It was survival. Men learned to live within limits without losing themselves entirely. Some succeeded more than others. Change, when it occurred, was subtle and internal. The prison did not demand transformation. It allowed it occasionally in quiet corners. Reflection, faith, and quiet change. In spaces set aside from routine, reflection found room to breathe. The chapel, the classroom, the library. These were not places of escape but of pause. Here, the institution loosened its grip slightly, allowing thought to move without immediate consequence. Faith took many forms. For some, it was structured and familiar. For others, it was simply the act of sitting quietly, acknowledging uncertainty. These moments did not erase the weight of incarceration. They redistributed it. Self-reflection was not always comfortable. Without constant distraction, questions surfaced. Not dramatic ones. Ordinary ones. How did I get here? What remains? What will be different, if anything? Answers were not required. The asking was enough. Change, when it came, did not announce itself. It showed up in habits. In patience. In restraint. In the ability to endure boredom without agitation. These were not traits celebrated outside, but they mattered here. Education continued to offer a bridge to something beyond the walls. Learning reframed time. A course had a beginning and an end. Progress could be measured. Completion meant something tangible in a place where achievement was otherwise abstract. Relationships shifted as release dates approached. Those nearing the end of their sentences carried a quiet tension. Hope mixed with apprehension. The world outside had continued without them. Re-entry loomed as both promise and threat. Kingston prepared men for release administratively. Forms were completed. Plans discussed. But the deeper transition remained personal. How to carry what had been learned here into a place that did not operate by the same rules. The prison did not provide answers. It provided conditions. Departure and the weight that remains. Leaving Kingston was as procedural as entering it. Paperwork, signatures, a final check. The gate opened. The wall receded. There was no ceremony. No acknowledgement of what had been endured or learned. The institution did not look back. Outside, space expanded abruptly. Sound changed. The absence of walls felt unfamiliar. Freedom did not arrive fully formed. It arrived cautiously, requiring adjustment. For those who had spent years inside, the world moved differently. Choices returned all at once. Simple decisions carried unexpected weight. The habits formed inside did not dissolve at the gate. They traveled outward, shaping behavior long after release. Kingston's influence extended beyond its physical boundaries. It lived in memory, in posture, in the way former inmates measured time. The prison had shaped Canada's justice system through policy and precedent. It had shaped lives more quietly, one routine day at a time. The building now stands empty, preserved as history. Its walls remain. The echoes linger. The men who passed through it continue on, carrying with them what the institution gave and took. The gate closes again, not for them but for those who will never enter. Stone returns to silence. Time moves forward, leaving its mark unevenly. The prison does not speak. But it remains. Echoes after stone. When the last men left Kingston, the prison did not immediately become silent. Buildings of this kind do not empty all at once. Sound lingers. Footsteps repeat themselves in memory. The walls hold more than temperature. They hold habit. An empty cell feels different from an occupied one. Without a body inside it, the space reveals its proportions more clearly. The cot seems shorter. The walls closer. The ceiling lower than remembered. What once felt routine now appears deliberate, shaped with intention rather than necessity. For decades, this room framed the inner lives of thousands of men. Each brought his own history into it. Each left something behind, even if nothing physical remained. A pattern of thought. A way of waiting. A posture learned in response to constant observation. The closing of Kingston marked an administrative decision, but it did not close the chapter it represents. Canada's approach to incarceration had been tested here over generations. Ideas about punishment, reform, and control were implemented, revised, and sometimes abandoned within these walls. The prison reflected the thinking of its time and in turn influenced what came after. Those who lived here carried the experience forward. Long after release, many spoke less about specific events and more about duration. The stretch of days that felt indistinguishable. The slow recalibration of the self to a system where autonomy was restricted but never fully erased. Reintegration did not erase the habits formed inside. Former inmates often described an ongoing negotiation with space. Sitting with their backs to walls. Noticing exits instinctively. Measuring conversations before speaking. These behaviors were not conscious decisions. They were learned responses reinforced by years of routine. Memory surfaced unpredictably. A metallic sound. A certain kind of light. A smell of disinfectant or old stone. These triggers did not arrive with commentary. They arrived as sensations, pulling the past into the present without warning. For some, the experience led to reflection that endured. Education completed inside became a foundation outside. Faith, once tentative, offered continuity. For others, the weight remained heavier, harder to integrate. The prison did not determine outcomes. It shaped conditions in which outcomes were negotiated. Kingston now stands as a site of memory rather than confinement. Tours move through spaces once restricted. Voices echo where silence was enforced. The transformation is visible but incomplete. History does not disappear when function changes. Visitors notice the craftsmanship of the stonework, the symmetry of the cell blocks, the ingenuity of systems designed to observe and regulate. What is less visible is the accumulation of ordinary days that gave the place its meaning. The waiting. The repetition. The quiet endurance. In the absence of people, the prison reveals its scale. It was never just a building. It was an idea made physical. That idea persists beyond demolition or preservation. It lives in policies, in institutions that replaced it, in debates that continue about what incarceration is meant to accomplish. For those who pass through Kingston, the experience resists simple interpretation. It was not uniformly destructive, nor was it reliably transformative. It was persistent. It imposed limits and revealed capacities. It constrained choice while demanding adaptation. The cell door, left open now, frames an empty corridor. Light reaches further than it once did. Dust settles where movement used to be regulated. The space waits, not for return but for recognition. What remains is not a lesson but a presence. Stone shaped by purpose. Time layered with experience. A place that once held lives in suspension, now holding memory instead. The prison does not offer resolution. It offers evidence. Of systems built with conviction. Of people navigating them quietly. Of consequences that extend beyond walls. The light shifts as afternoon fades. The corridor darkens gradually. No bell signals the change. No count is called. The building rests, carrying forward everything it has contained, without comment, without conclusion. Time that does not end. There is a kind of time that does not end when a sentence does. It does not announce itself. It simply continues, folding itself into daily life outside the walls. For many who lived inside institutions like this one, the prison became a reference point against which everything else was measured. Ordinary moments carried an unfamiliar weight. Standing in line at a store. Waiting for a bus. Sitting in a room where doors were unlocked. These situations were not threatening, but they were noticeable. The body responded before the mind did, tightening slightly, scanning automatically, preparing for rules that no longer applied. This was not fear in the conventional sense. It was conditioning. Years of routine had trained attention toward constraint. Freedom, when it returned, required practice. Some described it as learning a new language without instruction, relying on instinct shaped in a very different environment. Conversations outside often moved quickly, casually. Inside, words had been measured. Silence had meaning. This difference created distance. Former inmates sometimes found themselves listening more than speaking, uncertain where their experiences fit in a world that had continued uninterrupted. Employment, housing, and relationships presented practical challenges, but beneath them lay something quieter. Identity had been narrowed inside, reduced to number, schedule, and role. Rebuilding it required time and patience that were not always available. The institution had not asked who a person was beyond compliance. Outside, the question returned, unanswered and urgent. Some adapted by keeping parts of prison life intact. Routines remained rigid. Days were structured tightly. These habits offered stability, even if they were no longer necessary. Others rejected structure entirely, struggling with the absence of external limits. Neither approach was inherently successful or harmful. They were responses to the same prolonged experience of regulated living. The prison itself, now silent, continued to exert influence through memory. Former inmates rarely spoke of dramatic incidents. They spoke of duration, of waiting, of how time felt heavier there, stretched thin across repetition. These memories were not always painful. Sometimes they were neutral, even mundane. But their persistence revealed how deeply environment shapes perception. Space teaches. So does restriction. The corridor, empty now, once absorbed the movement of thousands of bodies. Each step taken here followed rules, both written and implied. Over time, those rules became internalized. They traveled outward with the people who left. Institutions like this one were built with confidence in their purpose. They were meant to correct, deter, contain. Over generations, their role shifted as understanding evolved. But the lived experience inside changed more slowly. Stone adapts reluctantly. The closure of the prison marked a turning point in policy, but not an erasure of consequence. New facilities replaced old ones. New language described old problems. The core tension remained: how to confine without erasing, how to punish without destroying. Those questions are not answered here. The building does not respond. It simply stands as record. As evening deepens, light recedes further down the corridor. The remaining bulb hums softly, indifferent to its audience. No one waits for count. No footsteps approach. Time continues to pass, but without structure it feels different. Less imposed. Less exact. What lingers is not instruction or warning. It is presence. The accumulated effect of years lived under constraint, now dispersed into the wider world. The prison no longer holds people. But it has not released everything it shaped. Stone remains. Memory remains. And somewhere between them, time moves on, unchanged, unresolved. What the walls never say. Courtyards like this were designed to be open without offering escape. Space was granted, but only within strict boundaries. For men who passed through Kingston, these yards became places where the body could move while the mind remained contained. Walking in slow loops. Pausing without purpose. Looking up at a slice of sky framed by stone. The sky mattered. It reminded men that something existed beyond the walls, even if it felt abstract. Weather became a form of connection. Cold sharpened awareness. Heat slowed it. Seasons marked time more reliably than calendars. Standing here now, empty, the yard reveals its scale differently. Without movement, it feels larger but also more exposed. There is nothing to occupy the space except memory. The ground bears no visible trace of the people who once stood here, but the absence feels intentional rather than accidental. Inside the institution, emotion was often managed through restraint. Displays of vulnerability carried risk. Strength was measured not by dominance but by control. Men learned to keep reactions small. To absorb frustration without release. This quiet discipline shaped behavior long after release. The walls did not explain this. They did not instruct. They simply enforced conditions in which certain responses were rewarded and others discouraged. Over time, those responses became habits. For many, the most enduring effect of incarceration was not fear, but narrowing. Life became focused on the immediate. The next count. The next meal. The next day. Long-term thinking was difficult in a place where the future felt distant and the present was heavily regulated. Outside, that narrowing did not immediately reverse. Planning felt unfamiliar. Possibility carried uncertainty rather than promise. Some described a lingering sense of suspension, as if part of them was still waiting for instruction. The prison did not intend this outcome, but it produced it nonetheless. Systems designed for containment rarely account for what happens after release. The transition back into open space requires a recalibration that no institution can fully provide. Looking at the yard now, it is tempting to see it as neutral. Concrete, stone, air. But neutrality was never its function. Every dimension was calculated. Every angle considered. The yard was part of a larger logic that governed movement, interaction, and time. That logic extended beyond punishment. It reflected a belief about order. About how people should be managed when they violated social norms. Kingston was not unique in this regard. It was exemplary. Its longevity gave it authority. Its practices influenced others. Policies tested here echoed across the country. In that sense, the prison shaped not only those inside it, but the broader system that surrounded it. The men who lived here became part of that system's evidence. Their experiences informed debates, reforms, and critiques. But lived experience does not translate cleanly into policy language. Much of it remains unspoken, carried privately. Standing in this empty yard, there is no clear narrative. No beginning or end. Only layers of use and disuse. The space resists interpretation. It does not argue for or against incarceration. It simply shows what it required. The wind moves across the concrete. A sound echoes briefly, then disappears. The walls remain unchanged. What the prison never says is perhaps what it reveals most clearly. That control can be efficient without being complete. That people adapt even in constrained environments. That adaptation leaves marks that persist. There is no final lesson here. No resolution offered by emptiness. The yard does not explain itself. It waits, holding the imprint of countless ordinary days, now indistinguishable from one another. Time continues to pass unmarked. The space remains neither active nor erased. And in that stillness, the prison's influence endures, quiet, unresolved, and largely unseen. Lives live between counts. Much of life inside Kingston unfolded in spaces like this. Not dramatic, not memorable in isolation. Just rooms where time was spent together, separately. Tables where men sat across from one another without necessarily speaking. Places where proximity did not guarantee connection. Conversation, when it happened, was careful. Stories were shared in fragments. Names from the outside were mentioned without context. Details were withheld, not always out of distrust but out of habit. Inside, knowing too much could be a liability. Not knowing was often safer. Daily life revolved around counts. Morning count. Midday count. Evening count. The repeated confirmation that everyone was still present, still contained. Time was divided not by clocks, but by verification. Between those moments stretched hours that needed to be filled, endured, or simply passed through. Men learned how to be alone in public. Sitting together without engaging. Sharing space while guarding interior lives. This form of coexistence became normal. It required effort, but it also provided a kind of quiet solidarity. No one needed to explain why they were tired, distracted, or withdrawn. Everyone understood the reason even if they did not articulate it. Boredom was not merely the absence of activity. It was a psychological condition shaped by repetition. Days resembled one another closely enough that memory blurred. Looking back, many former inmates described entire months as indistinct. Not empty but undifferentiated. Within that sameness, small variations carried significance. A different meal. A delayed count. A brief interruption in routine. These minor disruptions became points of reference, breaking the monotony just enough to register. Humor existed here, but it was understated. Dry observations. Brief exchanges. Laughter that rose and fell quickly, careful not to draw attention. Joy, when it appeared, was restrained. Excess emotion of any kind felt risky in a place that valued control. The institution did not prohibit humanity. It constrained its expression. Men adapted by compressing themselves emotionally, keeping reactions proportional to the environment. Over time, this compression became internalized. It felt normal. This is how lives were lived between counts. Not in moments of crisis but in endurance. In learning how to occupy time without letting it consume you. In finding ways to remain intact without appearing resistant. For some, writing offered release. Journals filled quietly, not always with confession, but with observation. Notes about weather. About routines. About thoughts that did not need to be shared. Writing created a private space within a public institution. For others, physical discipline became grounding. Exercise routines imposed structure on the body when the rest of life felt externally controlled. Muscles responded predictably. Progress could be measured. Strength provided a sense of agency that was otherwise limited. Yet even these coping mechanisms existed within boundaries. Equipment was restricted. Space was shared. Schedules were fixed. Nothing here was entirely self-directed. The communal areas now sit unused, preserved as part of history. But their purpose is harder to explain to those who never needed them. They were not social hubs in the conventional sense. They were pressure valves. Places where isolation was moderated without being eliminated. Standing in this empty room, the absence of people feels louder than their presence ever was. Chairs wait without expectation. Tables hold no marks of ownership. The space is neutral again, but it did not begin that way. The men who sat here brought with them anxieties that were rarely visible. Fear of the future. Concern for family. Regret that surfaced in quiet moments. These concerns were not always spoken, but they were shared in proximity. Simply being near others who understood provided a degree of relief. Kingston did not encourage vulnerability. But it did not entirely prevent it either. It allowed it to exist in narrow margins, between routines, between counts. Those margins mattered. They were where personal change, if it occurred, took root. Not through programs alone, but through sustained exposure to limits. Through time spent observing oneself under constraint. When release came, these experiences did not vanish. They influenced how former inmates approached shared spaces outside. Restaurants, waiting rooms, workplaces. Sitting with others without speaking felt familiar. Silence did not need to be filled. The habits learned here were adaptive responses, not flaws. But adaptation has consequences. Skills that ensure survival in confinement do not always translate cleanly into open environments. Looking at this room now, it is difficult to assign it meaning without imagining the lives that passed through it. The architecture alone does not tell the story. The story lived in the intervals, in the time between checks, in the quiet endurance of ordinary days. Nothing dramatic happened here, and that is precisely the point. This is where the prison did most of its work. Not through force but through persistence. The room remains. The walls hold no commentary. They simply reflect light and weight. And somewhere beyond this space, the men who once sat here continue their lives, carrying with them what was learned in rooms like this, long after the count stopped. The quiet that follows. In the end, places like this do not conclude. They do not resolve themselves. They recede. Kingston Penitentiary no longer holds men, but it still holds time. Not time as measured by sentences or schedules, but time as it settles into memory, architecture, and habit. The kind of time that does not ask permission to linger. The institution was built with certainty. Certainty about order. About discipline. About what was required to contain wrongdoing. Over generations, that certainty was questioned, revised, and partially abandoned. But while ideas shifted, the experience of living inside these walls changed slowly, if at all. For the men who passed through Kingston, incarceration was rarely defined by singular events. It was defined by accumulation. Days layered on days. Rules reinforced through repetition. Identity reshaped not by force but by consistency. Most did not leave transformed in any dramatic sense. They left altered in subtler ways. In how they understood silence. In how they navigated space. In how they waited. These changes were not always visible to others. They did not announce themselves. They surfaced quietly, in posture, in attention, in the way a room was read before it was entered. Kingston was never just a backdrop to these changes. It was an active participant. Its walls narrowed options. Its routine structured thought. Its design encouraged compliance through predictability rather than chaos. Now, with the cells empty and the corridors still, the prison offers no commentary on its own legacy. It does not defend itself. It does not apologize. It simply remains, bearing the physical evidence of an era when confinement was believed to produce clarity. What clarity it produced was personal, uneven, and often incomplete. Some found education here and carried it forward. Some found faith or discipline or restraint. Others carried unresolved weight, a sense of suspension that followed them long after release. None of these outcomes were guaranteed. The institution did not decide them. It shaped the conditions under which they emerged. The building's closure marked a shift in policy, but not an erasure of impact. Systems evolved. Language softened or hardened. Facilities changed. Yet the central question persisted, unchanged beneath the revisions. How does a society confine without hollowing out the people it confines? Kingston does not answer that question. It illustrates it. Standing here now, the absence of noise feels intentional. Not peaceful. Not ominous. Simply empty. The echoes that once defined this place exist only in memory, carried by those who learned how to live within its limits. The city around it continues. Traffic passes. Homes fill with light. The prison remains separate, set slightly apart as it always was. Stone holds its shape longer than policy. Architecture outlasts ideology. What was built to contain has become a vessel for remembrance. There is no final message carved into these walls. No conclusion offered by their endurance. They neither condemn nor justify what occurred within them. They stand. And in standing, they remind us that the deepest effects of incarceration are not always visible at the gate. They emerge later, quietly, in lives lived beyond the walls. The lights fade. The structure darkens. Nothing moves. The prison remains where it has always been, holding what it has always held. Not answers. Only time.